The cruelest words are often the ones spoken casually by someone you would have given everything for. Snow drifted softly beyond the enormous glass walls of our Lake Tahoe home, turning the pine-covered mountains into a watercolor of white and silver. Inside, the house glowed with Christmas lights. Golden reflections danced across polished hardwood floors. Laughter floated through every room. The scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh pine filled the air. To anyone looking from the outside, it was a perfect holiday gathering, the kind people post online and remember for years. I stood alone in the kitchen, arranging dessert plates while family members crowded the dining room. My husband, Ethan Morelli, sat at the center of the long table. Even among a room full of successful people, he naturally drew attention. Tall, confident, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit despite the casual holiday setting. The faint tattoo disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt hinted at a past few people fully understood. Everyone listened when Ethan spoke. Everyone laughed when Ethan joked. I had spent 7 years watching that happen. Most of the time I didn't mind. That night was different. I carried a tray of coffee cups toward the dining room when I realized I had forgotten the serving spoons. I quietly stepped back into the kitchen and moved toward the pantry. The door was partially open. Through the gap, I could hear voices from the dining room. First, I paid no attention. Then I heard Ethan's name. "Come on," his younger brother Ryan said with a laugh. "You and Hannah have been married forever. She can't be that difficult." Several people chuckled. I froze beside the pantry shelf. A strange feeling settled into my chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just instinct. The kind that tells you something important is about to happen. Ethan laughed. A relaxed laugh. Comfortable. Careless. Then he said it. Honestly, no one else would put up with Hannah. The room erupted. Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked. More laughter followed. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I had misheard him. My fingers tightened around the silver serving spoon in my hand. Maybe there was more. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he would explain. He didn't. Ryan laughed harder and asked if it was that bad. Ethan took a sip of his drink and said, "You have no idea." More laughter, more amusement. The conversation moved on. For everyone else, it was a harmless moment. 30 seconds at most. By dessert, most of them wouldn't even remember it happened. But I remembered every word, every pause, every laugh. I stood completely still behind the pantry door, while the sounds of celebration continued only a few feet away. The strange thing was that I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel surprised. What I felt was tired, deeply tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after carrying something for too long. Slowly, I placed the serving spoon back onto the shelf. I stared at my reflection in the small pantry window. The woman looking back at me seemed calm, almost detached, as if she had expected this moment long before it arrived. A few minutes later, I walked into the dining room carrying the coffee tray. No one noticed anything unusual. Ethan smiled briefly when he saw me. His family continued talking. Christmas music played softly through hidden speakers. Snow continued falling beyond the windows. I served coffee, collected empty plates, smiled when spoken to, and performed every role expected of me. Yet something had quietly changed. Not in the room, not in the family, in me. Later that night, after the last guest disappeared upstairs, and the lake outside became a sheet of black glass beneath the moonlight, I stood alone beside the giant window overlooking the snow-covered dock. Behind me, the house remained warm and bright. Ahead of me stretched silence. For the first time in years, I stopped wondering how to make everyone happy. Because the man I loved had unknowingly answered a question I had been asking myself for a very long time. The next morning, Lake Tahoe looked frozen in time. Fresh snow covered the dock, the pine trees, and the winding road leading up to the house. Sunlight reflected across the lake like scattered diamonds. Everything outside felt peaceful. Inside, something had quietly ended. I woke before dawn and slipped out of bed without making a sound. Ethan was still asleep. One arm rested across the empty side of the mattress, where I had been lying only moments earlier. For a second, I stood there watching him. 7 years of memories rushed through my mind. The first apartment, the late-night conversations, the impossible dreams we built together. Then I remembered his voice from the night before, the laughter, the certainty behind his words. I turned away before the memories could soften me. Downstairs, the house remained silent. The Christmas decorations still glowed faintly from timers set overnight. garland wrapped around the staircase, and stockings hung above the fireplace. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I moved through the rooms differently. Like a visitor, like someone preparing to leave a place emotionally long before leaving it physically. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan came downstairs. He found me sitting beside the enormous window overlooking the lake. A book rested open in my lap, although I hadn't read a single page. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. He poured coffee and walked over. Normally, he would kiss the top of my head before starting his day. Normally, I would ask about his schedule. Normally, we would spend at least 10 minutes talking before either of us opened our phones. That morning, none of those things happened. Ethan seemed to notice. "Everything okay?" he asked. I looked out toward the frozen shoreline and said, "Of course." He studied me for a moment. "You seem quiet." A small smile appeared on my face. Maybe I'm just tired. The answer satisfied him, or maybe he wanted it to. Within minutes, his phone rang. A business call, then another. By 9 o'clock, he had disappeared into his office. The rest of the day passed peacefully, at least on the surface. I answered emails, organized donations for the local school, wrapped a few remaining Christmas gifts, and smiled whenever someone spoke to me. Nobody would have noticed the difference. The change wasn't visible. It existed in the spaces between things. That evening, Ethan finished work later than usual. Around 7 o'clock, he walked into the dining room expecting dinner. The table was set. The meal was warm. Everything looked perfect. Only one thing was missing: me. Instead of waiting beside the table like I often did, I sat in the library reading. When he entered the room, surprise flashed across his face. "You already ate?" he asked. "About an hour ago." He looked confused. Without me, I marked my page calmly. "You were busy." Ethan stood there for a second longer than necessary. Then he slowly nodded and said, "Right." The conversation ended there. But small moments like that continued. The next day, I stopped waiting by the front window when he came home. The day after that, I stopped texting him during lunch. 3 days later, I stopped asking whether he would be home for dinner. None of it was done to punish him. That was the strange part. I simply stopped reaching. The effort disappeared quietly, the way snow melts beneath sunlight. One evening, nearly a week after Christmas, I sat alone at the piano in the great room. My fingers moved gently across the keys while twilight settled over the lake. Ethan walked in and paused. For years, he had heard me play almost every night. Recently, I had stopped. The music filled the house with a familiar sadness. When the song ended, he looked at me and smiled. "I've missed hearing that." I nodded politely and said, "Have you?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Ethan blinked. Not because the words were harsh, but because they were honest. Silence settled between us. Outside, snow drifted across the dock. Inside, something unfamiliar crossed Ethan's face. For the first time since Christmas, he seemed to realize that my silence wasn't temporary. It was becoming a new version of our life, and he had no idea why. By the second week of January, the house felt larger than it ever had before. Not because anything had changed physically. The soaring ceiling still overlooked the lake. The floor-to-ceiling windows still framed snow-covered pines and frozen docks. The stone fireplace still burned every evening. Yet somehow every room seemed to contain more empty space than before. Ethan noticed it first in the smallest places. One morning, he walked into the kitchen, expecting to find me at the counter organizing schedules for the local school fundraiser. The chair where I usually sat was empty. My notebook was gone. The coffee mug with the chipped handle I always used had disappeared from the drying rack. He found me instead in the sunroom overlooking the lake, quietly reading while sunlight reflected across the snow. "There you are," he said. I looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning." Something about the exchange felt strange. Not cold, not angry, just distant. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home early from a meeting. Normally, I would have met him at the front entrance, asked how his day went, and listened while he complained about contracts, negotiations, and endless phone calls. Instead, he walked through the front door to complete silence. He stood in the foyer for a moment before taking off his coat and calling my name. No answer. Eventually, he found me in the library, helping organize books for a charity auction. "I didn't hear you come in," I said. Ethan nodded slowly. "Usually you do." The words lingered between us. That night, another absence appeared. For years, I had ended every evening at the piano. Sometimes I played for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. The music became part of the rhythm of the house. Ethan often worked in his office while the sound drifted through the halls. He never realized how much he depended on it until it stopped. 3 nights passed without a single note, then 4, then 5. On the 6th night, he walked past the grand piano and paused. Dust had begun collecting on the glossy black surface. The bench sat untouched. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. The following weekend brought a fresh snowfall. Nearly 8 inches covered the property overnight. Ethan stood beside the giant window overlooking the lake while workers cleared the driveway below. His eyes moved toward the dock, stretching into the frozen water. Something felt wrong. It took him several seconds to identify it. The small wooden chair near the end of the dock was gone. Every summer evening, I sat there watching sunsets. Every autumn morning, I drank coffee there wrapped in blankets. It had remained in that exact spot for years. Now it was gone. He found it later inside the storage shed, folded away, carefully covered. Another small disappearance, another quiet retreat. One evening, Ethan's mother called. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes. After hanging up, he walked into the living room and found me reading near the fireplace. "Mom asked about you," he said. "That was nice of her. She wants us to come for dinner next week." I turned a page. "You should go." Ethan frowned. "Us. I have plans." "What plans?" The question sounded more frustrated than curious. I thought for a moment and said, "A community fundraiser." He stared at me. "You'd rather attend a fundraiser than dinner with my family." For the first time, I looked directly at him. "I'd rather be somewhere I feel welcome." The words landed softly, yet they hit harder than any argument ever could. Ethan didn't respond. He simply stood there while firelight flickered across the room. Later that night, after I went upstairs, he remained alone beside the fireplace. His eyes wandered across the house, the piano, the empty chair beside the window, the stack of books I had already packed for donation, the spaces where my habits used to live. For the first time, Ethan realized something unsettling. Hannah hadn't become louder after being hurt. She had become quieter, and somehow that silence was changing everything. The first person who made Ethan question everything wasn't a business partner, a family member, or one of his advisors. It was the groundskeeper. Late one snowy afternoon, Ethan walked outside while a fresh layer of powder settled across the property. The lake reflected a pale winter sky. Pine branches sagged beneath the weight of snow. Near the boathouse, an older man named Walter was clearing a pathway with a shovel. Walter had worked on the estate for nearly 15 years. Ethan nodded as he approached and said it was a cold day. Walter smiled. "Lake Tahoe always reminds us who is in charge." Ethan laughed quietly. For a moment, they stood watching the frozen shoreline. Then Walter glanced toward the house. "Mrs. Morelli hasn't been down here lately." Ethan followed his gaze. "Down where?" "The boathouse." Ethan frowned. "Why would Hannah spend time in the boathouse?" Walter looked surprised. "You didn't know." Ethan shook his head. Walter leaned against the shovel handle. "Every Thursday afternoon for almost 6 years." Ethan stared at him. "Doing what?" "Helping me." The answer made no sense. "Helping you with what?" Walter pointed toward a small storage building beside the dock. "School supply drives, winter coat donations, food collections. Sometimes she packed boxes until dark." Ethan looked at the building. He had passed it hundreds of times. Never once had he wondered what happened inside. "Why?" Walter asked softly. "You'd have to ask her." Ethan said nothing. Walter smiled. "The funny thing is, she never wanted anyone to know." That evening, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. The next morning, another strange encounter followed. He stopped at a local coffee shop before a meeting. The owner, a woman named Linda, greeted him warmly. "How is your wife?" Ethan hesitated. "She's fine." Linda smiled. "That woman saved my business." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" Linda pointed toward the espresso machine. 3 years ago, that machine broke down. I couldn't afford to replace it. Hannah paid for it. Ethan blinked. "She did. Made me promise never to tell anyone." Ethan stood there in silence. Linda laughed softly. "She's going to be annoyed that I told you." Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the marina, then the local elementary school, then a hardware store. Each stop brought another story, another person, another favor Hannah had quietly done. One teacher described donated art supplies. A store owner mentioned anonymous help during a difficult winter. A marina employee talked about scholarships for local students. The stories came from different people, different years, different circumstances, Yet every one of them ended the same way. Hannah helped. Hannah disappeared. Hannah never asked for recognition. Driving home through falling snow, Ethan felt something unfamiliar growing inside him. Confusion. Not because Hannah had helped people. He knew she was kind. What confused him was how little he actually knew about her life. That realization followed him into the evening. When he arrived home, he found me sitting near the great room window overlooking the lake. A blanket rested across my lap. A stack of community fundraising paperwork sat beside me. The setting sun painted the snow outside in shades of gold and pink. Ethan stood there for a long moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I looked up. "Of course." He sat across from me. "How long have you been helping people around town?" A small smile touched my lips. "That depends." "On what?" "On who is asking." Ethan almost smiled back. "Almost. I'm serious." I closed the folder in my lap. "Why?" He looked away briefly. "People keep telling me stories." The room felt quiet. Firelight flickered across the stone walls. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the dock. "They seem to know things about you that I don't," he admitted. I studied his face for a moment. There was no accusation there, only uncertainty. "Maybe you never asked," I said gently. The words weren't cruel. They weren't even defensive. Yet Ethan looked as though they had struck something deep inside him. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence stretched between us, while daylight slowly faded over the lake. And for the first time, Ethan began wondering whether the person he thought he understood best might actually be the person he knew least. 2 days after our conversation by the window, a winter storm rolled across Lake Tahoe. Snow covered the mountains in fresh white layers, and strong winds rattled the glass walls of the house throughout the night. By morning, the world outside looked untouched. Ethan left early for a meeting in Reno, and I spent the day sorting donation requests for several local families. The hours passed quietly, peacefully. That evening, however, something happened that neither of us expected. Around sunset, a power fluctuation triggered a warning in one of the storage rooms beneath the house. The room contained old furniture, holiday decorations, and boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Ethan went downstairs to check the problem while I remained upstairs finishing paperwork. The lights flickered once, then everything returned to normal. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps moving through the hallway above. Heavy, slow, thoughtful. When Ethan entered the great room, he carried a small wooden box in his hands. Dust covered the lid. I recognized it immediately. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen that box in years. "What is that?" Ethan asked. His voice sounded strangely careful. I looked toward the fireplace. "Just old things." He set the box on the coffee table between us. "May I?" For a second I considered saying no. Then I realized it no longer mattered. "If you want." Ethan lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes tied together with faded ribbon. Thank you notes, Christmas cards, photographs, receipts. Small reminders of moments I never talked about. Ethan picked up the first envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. He unfolded the letter and began reading silently. I watched his expression change. Then he opened another and another. One note came from a teacher thanking an anonymous donor for funding a school music program. Another came from a widow whose mortgage payment had been covered after her husband passed away. Another contained a crayon drawing from a child. Across the top, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Miss Hannah." Ethan sat down without saying anything. The room remained silent except for the crackling fire. Snow drifted outside beyond the giant windows. He reached deeper into the box and pulled out a photograph. I closed my eyes briefly. I knew which one it was. The image showed a small community center nearly 6 years earlier. Volunteers stood together holding boxes of donated winter coats. I stood near the back of the group smiling. Ethan turned the photograph over. A handwritten date appeared on the back. His eyebrows pulled together. This was during the year my company almost collapsed. I nodded. He stared at the picture. "You never told me about any of this. You never asked." The answer escaped before I could stop it. Ethan lowered the photograph. There was no anger in his face, only confusion. Then he found the folder hidden beneath the letters. My breath caught. I had forgotten it was still there. He opened it carefully. Several documents slid into his lap. Financial records, property papers, bank statements. The color slowly drained from his face. He read the first page twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked up at me. "Hannah." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "These documents show you sold your inheritance." I said nothing. The fire popped softly behind us. Ethan looked back down at the papers 5 years ago. I nodded. Silence filled the room. Outside, snow continued falling across the frozen dock. Inside, Ethan stared at the records that explained something he had never understood. During the worst year of his life, when his business stood on the edge of failure, funding had appeared unexpectedly. Investors stepped in. Debts were paid. Opportunities reopened. Ethan always believed luck had saved him. Sitting there with those documents in his hands, he finally discovered the truth. There had never been luck, and as he slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine, I realized he was looking at me differently than ever before. The storm lingered for 2 more days after Ethan found the documents. Snow continued falling across the mountains, covering roads and rooftops in fresh white layers. Inside the house, however, something far more unsettling had settled over him. For years, Ethan had believed he was the one carrying our marriage, the one solving problems, the one protecting our future. Now, every memory seemed different. Every assumption felt unstable. He spent hours alone in his office, staring at financial reports he had reviewed hundreds of times before. Numbers that once represented his success now reminded him of something else entirely, the sacrifice hidden behind them. On the 3rd morning, he found me in the sunroom overlooking the lake. The winter sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Sunlight danced across the snow outside. I sat quietly sorting paperwork for a scholarship fund. Ethan stopped in the doorway. "Why did you do it?" he asked. I looked up. "Do what?" He held the inheritance documents in his hand. "Sell everything." The room became very still. I set down my pen, because we needed it. Ethan shook his head slowly. "You never told me." I looked toward the lake. "You were already carrying enough." He stared at me as if trying to understand a language he had never learned. "That was your family's property. It was just property. It was your future." A faint smile touched my lips. "You were my future." The words were simple, honest, unremarkable on the surface. Yet Ethan looked as though they had taken the air from his lungs. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he lowered his eyes. "I thought the investors saved me." I nodded. "That's what everyone believed." He sat down across from me. The documents rested forgotten in his lap. Outside, sunlight reflected across the frozen shoreline. Inside, years of misunderstanding quietly stood between us. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked. "Because it wasn't a gift." "Then what was it?" I looked at him carefully. "It was a marriage." Ethan said nothing. Later that afternoon, he left the house without explanation. Around sunset, he drove into town. Snowbanks lined the streets. Christmas decorations still hung from storefronts. The season was ending, but traces remained everywhere. Ethan stopped at a small cafe near the marina. While waiting for coffee, he overheard 2 women talking at a nearby table. One of them mentioned my name. Normally, he might have ignored it. This time he listened. "Hannah helped my sister after the accident," one woman said. "She made sure the kids had everything they needed." The other nodded. "That sounds like her." Ethan lowered his cup slowly. Another story, another person, another piece of a life he never fully saw. On his way home, he stopped by the community center. The building was nearly empty. Only a few volunteers remained. One of them recognized him immediately, Mr. Morelli. Ethan smiled politely. "Can I ask you something?" The volunteer nodded. "Anything." Ethan hesitated. "How long has Hannah been helping here?" The woman laughed softly. "Longer than I have." "And how long is that?" "Almost 7 years." Ethan looked away toward a bulletin board covered with photographs. School events, food drives, fundraisers, community projects. My face appeared in dozens of them, sometimes in the background, sometimes barely visible at all, never at the center, never seeking attention. The volunteer followed his gaze. She always avoids the camera. Ethan swallowed hard. Driving back through the mountains that night, one thought refused to leave him. He remembered Christmas dinner, the laughter, the casual cruelty hidden inside a joke. He remembered saying no one else would put up with his wife. The memory now felt unbearable, because the more he learned, the clearer one truth became. Hannah had never been the difficult one in their marriage. She had simply been the one carrying burdens he never noticed. And for the first time since that Christmas night, Ethan began wondering whether the person who needed understanding all along wasn't him. It had been her. The moment that finally broke Ethan happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. There was no storm, no dramatic confrontation, no life-changing discovery hidden inside a box, just a quiet conversation he was never supposed to hear. The day began like any other. Snow still covered the mountains surrounding Lake Tahoe, but warmer temperatures had begun softening the edges of winter. Sunlight reflected across the lake outside the giant windows, filling the house with pale gold light. Around noon, I left for a meeting with a longtime friend named Claire. We met every few weeks at a small lakeside cafe near the marina. Ethan knew where I was going. What he didn't know was that he would end up there too. A last-minute cancellation brought him into town earlier than expected. He stopped at the same cafe intending to grab coffee before heading home. When he walked inside, he noticed me immediately. I sat near a window overlooking the water. Claire sat across from me. We were deep in conversation. Ethan later told me he planned to say hello. Then he heard his name. Instinct made him stop. Neither Claire nor I noticed him. He remained near the entrance, partially hidden behind a bookshelf filled with local travel guides and postcards. "Have things gotten any better?" Claire asked gently. I looked out toward the lake for several seconds before answering. "I don't know. Do you think he understands now?" A faint smile crossed my face. Not bitter, not angry, just tired. Understanding and regret aren't the same thing. Claire lowered her coffee cup. "Do you still think about what he said?" The question hung in the air between us. Outside, sunlight sparkled across the water. Boats drifted quietly near the marina. For a moment, I simply watched them. Then I nodded. "Sometimes." Claire frowned. "I would never have forgiven him." I laughed softly. "That's because you think the worst part was what he said." Ethan stood completely still. Every sound around him seemed to disappear. Claire leaned forward. "Then what was the worst part?" I looked down at my hands resting on the table. The answer came quietly. "The saddest thing isn't what he said." Claire waited. So did Ethan. Finally, I looked back up. "The saddest thing is that he truly believed it." Silence followed, not uncomfortable silence, the kind that appears when a truth is too heavy to answer immediately. Claire's expression softened. "Hannah." I shook my head gently. "That's what hurt." My voice remained calm, not the joke, not the laughter. The fact that after 7 years together, he looked at our life and honestly thought he was the one carrying me. Across the cafe, Ethan felt something collapse inside him, because for the first time, he understood what his words had actually done. They hadn't embarrassed me. They had revealed what I believed he thought of me. Claire reached across the table and touched my hand. "You loved him." I smiled sadly. "I still do." Those 4 words somehow made everything worse. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The guilt settling over him felt heavier than anything he had experienced in years. "Then why did you stop trying?" Claire asked. I looked toward the lake again. The answer came after a long pause. "Because eventually you get tired of explaining your value to someone who should already know it." Ethan never forgot that sentence. Later, he would remember every word, every pause, every expression on my face. He left the cafe without speaking to me, without letting me know he had been there. When he arrived home, he stood alone at the end of the dock, while the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. The lake stretched endlessly before him. For years, he had believed our marriage was secure because I never complained, never demanded, never left. Standing there in the fading light, Ethan finally realized he had mistaken my patience for permanence. And for the first time in his life, he became afraid that he might lose the one person who had been holding everything together all along. The family dinner took place on the first Saturday of February. Snow still covered the mountains surrounding Lake Tahoe, but the skies were clear and bright. Ethan's mother insisted on hosting everyone at her lakeside lodge a few miles from our home. By sunset, the house was filled with relatives, laughter, and the familiar noise of people who had known each other for decades. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, Ethan felt like a man walking into a room full of memories he no longer trusted. We arrived together, but the distance between us remained. Not physical distance, emotional distance. The kind that cannot be measured in feet. Throughout the evening, family members gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and old photographs. I helped in the kitchen when needed, smiled politely, and joined conversations when invited. No different from any previous gathering. Yet Ethan watched everything differently now. He noticed how often I made sure everyone else was comfortable before sitting down myself. He noticed how many small tasks I handled without anyone asking. He noticed things he should have seen years earlier. Dinner was nearly finished when the moment arrived. Ethan's cousin Melissa laughed while discussing marriage. Relationships are all about patience, she joked. Several people nodded. Then Ryan grinned and pointed toward Ethan. You should teach a masterclass on patience. A few relatives chuckled. Ethan looked up slowly. He knew exactly where the conversation was going. Melissa laughed. Honestly, if anyone deserves an award, it's Ethan. More laughter followed. Not everyone could deal with Hannah for this long. The room erupted with amusement. Forks paused above plates, wine glasses lifted, smiles spread across familiar faces. 2 months earlier, Ethan would have laughed too. 2 months earlier, he probably would have added another joke. Instead, complete silence settled over him. Across the table, I lowered my eyes toward my plate. The reaction was automatic, familiar, practiced. Ethan saw it happen, and suddenly he realized something devastating. This wasn't the first time. It was simply the first time he had been paying attention. The laughter continued for several seconds. Then Ethan pushed back his chair. The sound cut through the room like a bell. Conversation stopped. Faces turned toward him. Ryan smiled awkwardly. Relax. We're just joking. Ethan looked at his brother, then at the rest of the table. Finally, his eyes found me. I remained silent, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for everyone to move on, waiting for what always happened. But this time, something different happened instead. Ethan stood. No, he said quietly. The room became still. It isn't a joke. Nobody spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. Ethan took a slow breath. The funny thing is that for years I thought those comments were harmless. His voice remained calm, steady, honest. I thought I was laughing with everyone else. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ethan continued. What I was actually doing was disrespecting my wife. Shock spread across several faces. Ethan's mother stared at him. Melissa looked down at her plate. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. Ethan wasn't finished. The truth is that Hannah has spent years doing things for people without asking for recognition. He glanced toward me again, including me. I felt my chest tighten. The room remained completely silent. Ethan looked around the table. If anyone here thinks I was the one carrying our marriage, then you don't know the full story. No anger, no accusations, just truth. The kind that cannot be argued with. He slowly returned his attention to me. I know that now. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then something remarkable happened. Ethan's mother lowered her eyes and spoke softly. Hannah, I owe you an apology. The words seemed to unlock something in the room. One by one others followed. Quiet apologies, embarrassed expressions, uncomfortable honesty. None of it erased the past. None of it repaired years of misunderstanding. But it mattered because for the first time I wasn't standing alone. Later that night, as snow fell gently outside the lodge windows, Ethan walked beside me toward the car. Neither of us spoke immediately. The cold air filled the silence between us. Then he stopped beside the snow-covered driveway and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pride, not confidence. Humility. And for the first time since Christmas, I realized he was no longer trying to defend himself. He was trying to become someone worthy of being forgiven. 2 weeks after the family dinner, winter began loosening its grip on Lake Tahoe. The snow still covered the mountains, but patches of dark earth appeared along the shoreline. The lake reflected a softer sky now. Spring was coming. For the first time in months, the world seemed willing to move forward. I wasn't sure whether our marriage would do the same. On a quiet Saturday morning, I woke before sunrise and walked down to the dock alone. Thin layers of frost covered the wooden planks. The water stretched endlessly before me, calm and silver beneath the early light. This had always been my favorite place to think, my favorite place to breathe. I stood there for nearly 20 minutes before hearing footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan stopped a few feet away. Neither of us spoke immediately. The lake filled the silence between us. Gentle waves touched the shore. Distant birds crossed the sky above the mountains. Finally, Ethan stepped forward carrying something in his hands, a small wooden box. The same box he had discovered weeks earlier. He held it carefully, almost reverently. I brought this back to you, he said quietly. I looked down at it. The old letters, the photographs, the thank you notes. Years of memories. Years of things I never thought mattered to anyone else. Ethan placed the box on the dock railing. I read every letter. His voice remained calm. Every photograph, every receipt, every note. I said nothing. Do you know what I realized? He asked. Slowly I shook my head. Ethan looked out across the water. For a long moment, he seemed to search for the right words. I spent years measuring value the wrong way. The morning wind moved through his dark hair. The tattoo near his collar disappeared beneath a winter coat. He looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally. I measured success by money, influence, growth, business. He glanced toward the box. You measure it by people. The truth of the statement settled quietly between us. Ethan lowered his eyes. The worst part isn't that I was wrong. His voice softened. The worst part is that I never stopped long enough to see what was right in front of me. My chest tightened. The sincerity in his voice made it impossible to look away. Ethan reached into the box and carefully removed one of the letters. A simple thank you card from years earlier. He smiled sadly. I thought I was the one carrying us. The words hung in the cold morning air. I thought I was the reason we survived difficult years. He shook his head slowly. But every page in this box tells a different story. I felt tears gathering behind my eyes, not because of what he said, because he finally understood. Ethan looked directly at me. There was no pride left in his expression, no arrogance, no certainty, only honesty. You carried more than I ever knew. Silence followed. The lake shimmered beneath the rising sun. Somewhere across the water, a boat engine started in the distance. Life continued moving forward. Ethan stepped closer. I can't erase what I said. He swallowed hard. I can't erase what I believed. His eyes never left mine. But if you allow me to, I would like to spend the rest of my life proving that I learned from it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The months of distance, the hurt, the disappointment, none of it disappeared instantly. Real healing never works that way. Yet something important had changed. The truth had finally been spoken out loud. I looked at the box resting between us. Then at the man standing beside me, the same man I had loved for 7 years, the same man who had hurt me, the same man who had finally chosen humility over pride. Slowly, I placed my hand on top of the wooden box. Ethan's hand rested there too. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet it felt larger than any speech, larger than any apology. As sunlight spread across the lake and winter slowly surrendered to spring, I realized something I had nearly forgotten. The strongest people are often not the ones who speak the loudest. They are the ones who quietly carry the weight no one else notices. And sometimes love begins healing the moment someone finally sees that weight and chooses to help carry it.